Hello and welcome. I wanted to just very quickly go over some very common mistakes from Homework 1 in CIS 2110. Just to kick it off, the variable names that some people use were just a little bit too short. And so, for example, the main goal for variables in your code is that they are self-documenting. That means that the names of the variables should be self-explanatory to anyone who is familiar with the product. For example, I know what GPA means, and I think that student SID is probably student ID, but I really don't know what the C stands for in SIDC down here. Also HC, I think that's hours completed, but I don't know what that is. So SIDC. Better variable name would be standard ID with an underscore in there. HC, hours count, I don't know, but let's call it hours underscore count. That HC is just too short, it's too cryptic. Also, it's okay to use hyphens and underscores, and I encourage that. You don't want to use spaces in your variable names, but no other symbols besides numbers and letters, hyphens and underscores. So no periods, commas, hashtags, any other special symbols. Also note that this user has several variables that are named num. You want to give your variables a name. Something meaningful would be great. This is from the actual homework. So for example, A is equal to B times C. This is just bad. I have no idea what that means. If I wanted to say P equals H times W, this really isn't any better. You might know what the P stands for, but nobody else does. Even if you've put that in a comment somewhere, that's not very helpful. Go ahead and say pay equals hours times wage. This is much, much better. And if you really wanted this to be self-documenting code, you would say weekly pay equals hours worked times hourly wage. This is self-documenting code. I understand that typing long variable names has at least two disadvantages. It's very tedious to keep typing those long variable names, and there's lots of opportunity to make mistakes and typos here. The huge advantage is here, spaghetti code is a coder's worst nightmare, and somebody may or may not someday have to come along and look at your code, but if they ever do, you don't want them reading A equals B times C. A couple mistakes that were common in the human level walkthroughs. First off, you can see that they have variable names. They're using spaces, and you don't want to do that in your code for reasons that we'll understand better as we start to code. The students made not a huge mistake, but they didn't interpret the problem right. They were supposed to have output, the inputs are made, and then immediately outputs are made for student ID code, GPA, and hours completed. So these lines should have all been filled up as the person processed this. The last thing that's wrong with this is this person does their final output in the step before inputting the kill flag. How did they know to do this final output if no one had input the kill flag? So this row should be moved down one so that it reads input student 777, their GPA is 3.55, hours completed was 98. Go to and then they should have output that data. Then they go down to the final step, input -1, and that says stop and give me the final outputs, which are should be these numbers down here. Very common error on this homework. This student had a couple of problems. Their program level walkthrough wasn't annotated. They're also missing the outputs for every time that a student ID, grade point average, and hours are input. They're doing an average GPA, which was not asked for. And they are giving me all the outputs in one space. The homework specifically asked for those outputs to be given individually. Again, this is just another example of giving those final outputs. They're called aggregates, actually, those numbers that are gleaned from other inputs, and then they give their flags. This is a very common error. Okay. With this one, there's a small formula here, and actually at least 3 students made this exact error. Their average number of hours is equal to count divided by total numbers. It's flipped around. It should be average number of hours is total number of hours divided by the count of the number of students. A fairly common error, I'd say about a quarter of the class made some kind of error with trying to use cardinality to kill the program. What you were asked to do was use the flag methodology that's discussed in the book, and that means when we put in -1 for our student ID, The cardinality mistake typically looked just about like this. There was a cardinality variable where they entered and said, I'm going to put in 7. There was some kind of an attempt to count that looked usually something just like this. If the count is greater than or equal to 7, then stop. You don't want to do that. What you wanted to do was keep track of what's being input and ask, have they input -1? We'll see the exact logic here in a second. You'll see that this student did a great job, but they just said, hey, I know that it's time to look for the flag because as a human I know that I'm done. But a computer doesn't know that. You needed to check for that input of -1 after every student ID was input. So this is a good job, okay? And this is that student's notes, but they have not done a sufficient job of checking for the -1 flag. This set of notes is exceptionally well done. You can see that they have color-coded everything. So when they entered something, it was red. Their working memory is green, etc., etc. They do check to see, is the current student ID equal to -1? So they check. They say, is the current student ID that was just input student ID code, is that equal to -1? In this case, it evaluated as false, so they continued. Their one mistake here is what? That's right, they don't output the values that were given for each student each time. And before this was even due, they caught that mistake, and here's their corrected notes. They enter the term, they output the term. They input the student ID code, they output the student ID code. They set the current ID code, and then they check to see, is my current student ID code equal to -1? And they do that for every student ID code that's input until they get the student ID code -1. This is some of the common mistakes from Homework 1, quick and dirty. Please get a hold of me if you have any questions. Have a good one.